Good evening. Hey, I'm just curious, does anyone know where that is? That's not in the family section back there. Okay, a few of you. Thanks for having me. And I'd venture to say that everyone in this room subscribes to the notion that if we don't take care of our natural environment, if we don't steward our natural resources, ultimately our human communities suffer. And I also subscribe to that notion. I'm of the opinion that as an environmental community, we often don't talk about the converse of that statement. That if we don't think and take care of our human communities, if our families are struggling, if our businesses are failing and our communities are collapsing, we don't have a lot of attention given to the health of our environment. And about 10 years ago, a number of us over on the Washington side of the river, mostly up in the smaller rural communities around Mount Adams, got together to form Mount Adams Resource Stewards. I don't know why the graphics aren't showing up here, but we had a nice little logo there, created by none other than Nate Ulrich back there, to really focus in on that idea, on that linkage between environmental health and community health. And focused in on a number of projects that weren't just conservation and orientation, but also on rural economic and community revitalization. And we quickly came to the realization that who owned our forests, especially in these areas that had such strong ties to the timber industry historically, that who owned our forests had tremendous implications for the quality of forest management that we were seeing and the well-being of our communities. Go to the next slide, please. I know there are a lot of things going on in these slides that we could talk about to the nth degree, but from a rural community perspective, especially for rural communities that were so tied to their forests, we increasingly feel like we're being cut out, we're being burned out, and lastly, we're being locked out of the forests that surround our communities and our homes. And if you go to the next slide, this was well captured by actually in a real TED Talk given by a colleague that works for the Nisqually Land Trust up in Western Washington last year, where he described rural communities in the Pacific Northwest, rural timber communities, as increasingly being like timber colonies. I don't know if you can see the graphics up here. This is from a Timberland Investors website where they talk about this massive conversion of forest land ownership in the Pacific Northwest. Actually, this talks about the U.S. West and the U.S. South. Between 1977, when about 1% was held by institutional investors, to today where it's over 83% of private forest lands are owned by these real estate investment trusts and institutional investment mechanisms. And getting back to that timber colony idea, most of our logs, or an increasing amount of our logs, are exported overseas to countries like China, Japan, and South Korea, and the profits are shipped to the East Coast and overseas to often to anonymous investors. Locally, just to orient you quickly to this map of Mount Adams forest ownership, here's White Salmon, Trout Lake, Glenwood. This is the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in green and the Yakima Reservation in brown. All these salmon-colored lands are currently owned by these timberland investment organizations that are based out of Toronto, Boston, Copenhagen. If you try to get to the bottom of who actually owns them, you can't. They're often Delaware-registered corporations, and I guess the one positive, both discouraging and encouraging aside of that, is that they tend to own lands on average for about 10 years. Now, in the case of most of these lands, we've had 4 different owners since 2000. So that presents us both with challenges as communities working in these areas and for the environment, but also with opportunities as we look at the next couple, 3, 4, 5 years, as there's going to be a lot of change in ownership in this area. So in response, we started asking as an organization in our communities, what can we do about this? Is there an opportunity for a nonprofit organization looking at land conservation opportunities and stewardship to actually purchase some of these forest lands for community-based management? And in 2008, we got a group of about 12, 13 community members that represented leaders in the community, conservation interests, loggers, ranchers, business folks. And we went back to New England, where they've been working on these kinds of projects for about 15 years. And this was actually a stop in Maine in the Down East Lakes region, where a group had raised over $32 million at that point in time to conserve over 30,000 acres of their working forest land. Let's go to the next slide. So we got back and we started gathering the folks in local communities, having some conversations about what we could do. Interviewed wildlife and fisheries biologists trying to help us prioritize lands, foresters, other folks that had an interest in that landscape. And in 2011, we struck out with our first purchase effort and bought the 100 acres surrounding the mill pond that's up in the Glenwood Valley. And here are just a few shots of what that particular property looks like. Some of the things that we've been engaged in that range from environmental education activities. We actually now have a forestry curriculum up there in the high school in Glenwood, to ice skating on the pond out in winters, which wasn't allowed under previous ownership, to stewarding the environment. There's a lot of restoration going on. As these companies have come in, they bought these forests up and they basically liquidated stands of timber. Right now we're working on our second acquisition. It's a 280-acre property that buffers the Convoy Lake National Wildlife Refuge, if you know that property, or this incredible place here in the Gorge. It's about 2 miles of road frontage between Trout Lake and Glenwood. And so if anyone has any interest in ever visiting this property, it's a spectacular property, and there's no better time to visit it than in the upcoming weeks when the camas is in bloom out in the Convoy Lake National Wildlife Refuge and the birds are active. So happy to show you around. But that's our current fundraising hurdle. And from our perspective, you know, we see that there's so much interest and support and appreciation for this idea of bringing local ownership for our businesses and our institutions, not only local ownership, but local management. And from our perspective, that's something that should apply to forests as well. Thank you.